Welcome to the America's 360 podcast. Get the inside scoop and the outside perspective on the latest developments from Canada, Latin America, and everywhere in between. America's 360 is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars.
Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is America's 360, a podcast brought to you by the world's #1 think tank for regional studies, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. This program is a collaboration among the Wilson Center's Argentina Project, Brazil Institute, Canada Institute, Latin American Program, and Mexico Institute. Well, we often try to understand current events by invoking terminology used during past moments in history. Talk of a new Cold War provides a prominent example of that. A wave of left-wing election victories in Latin America back in the late 1990s and early 2000s is commonly referred to as the pink tide. And many analysts are invoking that term today to describe recent election results throughout the region, with talk of a second wave pink tide. But there are always limits to the utility of describing the present by invoking the past. So today we're going to ask our panel to help us understand how this new pink tide may be different from its predecessor of 2 decades ago. So let's get to it. Please welcome to the program Wilson Center Distinguished Fellow Cindy Arnson.
Hi, John.
Mexico Institute Director Andrew Rudman.
Hi, John.
Latin American Program Director Benjamin Gadan.
Greetings, John.
And Canada Institute Director Christopher Sands.
Hello, bonjour, John.
Well, hello to all of you. Great to see you again. I thought we could begin with a bit of a history lesson. I'm assuming many of our viewers, or listeners, I should say, are well versed in the notion of a pink tide, but just not to leave anyone on the sidelines of the discussion. I'm going to ask either Benjamin or Cindy or to put your heads together and give us a little history lesson of that previous pink tide that we're referencing. Cindy, go ahead, please.
Thanks, John. I can start with this. The previous pink tide was very much a response to the kinds of neoliberal market reforms that Latin American governments had made in the 1990s in the wake of the debt crisis, the lost decade of the 1980s. Restructuring that left a lot of unemployment, unmet social demands, and that kind of thing, so that the election of this wave of left leaders, starting with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, started coming to power in 98, 99, and throughout the 2000s. The difference and the main, it's just a huge difference. You have to understand political economy to really understand the differences between the left in the 2000s and the left now. Important also to distinguish between the authoritarian left, which is what you see in Venezuela. You also saw to a lesser extent in Ecuador and Bolivia, and the more social democratic or liberal democratic left in Chile, Uruguay, and elsewhere. The main difference between now and then, I think, is in external economic circumstances. The years of the 2000s saw this enormous commodities boom that gave left governments tremendous resources to channel money into domestic social programs. And the context, the international context, is completely different right now, where governments are coming out of a pandemic. They're faced with high inflation because not only of tightening of interest rates in the United States and elsewhere, but also the war in Ukraine and what that's done to soaring food and energy prices. Coming out of the pandemic, high levels of debt to GDP, which limits borrowing for continued social spending. So the economic conditions are completely different in this 2 decades that we have seen, a wave of left governments. And I'll maybe give Benjamin a handoff by saying that a lot of the left governments that seem to show a swing of the pendulum really are more an anti-incumbent wave that has come about as a result principally of the pandemic, but not solely. I'll stop there.
Benjamin Gadan.
Yeah, I think another distinction that's important is precisely what Cindy pointed out, which is the original pink tide really had some ideologically cohesive ideas behind it. It was this rejection of the so-called Washington consensus, these neoliberal ideas, including a shrinking of the state and opening of markets. This time around, it really is just a rejection of incumbents who happen to have largely been conservatives or center-right parties and individuals. And so what you've seen now does not seem to reflect a big ideological transformation amongst Latin American voters. It's just anguish at the difficult conditions in the region and a lack of confidence in public institutions. And I think you're already seeing the possibility of this so-called new pink tide reversing itself. And there will be an election in October in Argentina where very likely the government will pass from leftist hands into the hands of conservatives, maybe even a far-right libertarian candidate. And so there's reason to believe that this trend might already be petering out.
Well, thanks to both of you for both the history lesson and connecting us to today and pointing out the differences. One thing I wanted to ask you about before we dive more into the current situation is about the legacy factor, right? All political movements come and go and they rise and fall, but sometimes they leave remnants that are part of the scene in a lasting way. I think here in the United States, Ronald Reagan's anti-government rhetoric is still a big part of the way Americans think about government and politics, even though the Reagan years seem like a very distant memory when you compare it to today's conservatism. So do we see any remnants like that in the region from the previous pink tide? What is the lasting legacy, if such a thing exists?
What I'd say, John, is that some of the motivating factors that led to that first transformation remain. This idea that neoliberalism is a dirty word, that the region did not succeed with some of those policies that Cindy referenced in the 1990s, but also that period, thanks not necessarily to the policies during the original pink tide, but thanks to the high commodity prices in that so-called commodity supercycle era, did lead to a reduction of poverty and a big increase in the middle class, particularly in large countries like Brazil. And so I do think there are some legacies from that era, and that even if the so-called new pink tide is motivated by very different external and regional conditions, I wouldn't discount some of the happy memories from that era, motivating voters in some cases and other observers to be excited about a potential new pink tide era, again, for however long it will last.
Sure. John, the legacy, I think, speaks to the issue of expectations, popular expectations in bringing the left back into power, that these governments would be more helpful to their economic situation. There were huge increases in poverty, inequality, and unemployment during the pandemic. And I think there's the hope, in a lot of electorates that a return of the left will reinvigorate some of those social programs. And I think that there's going to be a great deal of frustration because governments face enormous resource constraints and a number of other domestic things like, rising crime that has taken on greater salience. So the legacy issue would be a sense that among the left, that the state, that the government itself has a much larger role to play in directing the economy and in generating social welfare. This is very different from sort of a laissez-faire capitalist view. And that is, I think, a continuity. But again, given the very different conditions economically, internationally, it's going to be very hard for the left to live up to that promise.
Yeah, those expectations, the context matters, and the context is not conducive to some of the expectations. Andrew, this has been described as a less pronounced and weaker tide. AMLO, how does he fit into this? How does Mexico fit into this movement?
Thanks. Great question, John. I think as I was listening to Cindy and Benjamin, there are ways in which Mexico fits what they said and ways that it doesn't. The ways that it does, certainly, I think it was Benjamin who said neoliberalism is a dirty word, and that is certainly true in Mexico, where anybody who opposes AMLO or anything that the AMLO administration has proposed is considered to be a neoliberal, meaning a dirty word. It's also true that López Obrador envisions a larger role of the state and a smaller role for the private sector. I think maybe one of the differences, though, is that in a lot of ways, López Obrador doesn't really fit into the leftist model in that he's fiscally quite conservative and he's socially conservative. So it's sort of an interesting dichotomy in that in some ways he would fit that that new pink tide, but in other ways, I suspect the more pink members maybe wouldn't see AMLO as fully on board. I mean, it prompts me to wonder, maybe Cindy or Benjamin would comment. I think sometimes Lopez Obrador would like to position himself as sort of the elder statesman of the new pink tide. It's not clear to me. I don't know what Cindy or Benjamin, what you guys think. It's not clear to me that the rest of the leaders in the hemisphere necessarily see him in that role.
Yeah, well, and as you say, left doesn't always mean the same thing depending on where you're looking. And Cindy already mentioned the dictators in the region who are leftists, but that's a far cry from what some of the other people were talking about. So is this populist left? Is that the category that AMLO fits into?
Absolutely. Absolutely populist. And as I said, left in many ways, left in the sense of believing in a stronger role of the state, but not left in the sense of, he's very much redistributed wealth and created lots of cash transfer programs, but he's been very careful not to increase the debt in any way at all. So in that sense, he's been...
Cindy and Benjamin, Andrew has baited the hook. Any thoughts on how President AMLO fits into the equation?
I would say that whatever AMLO's ambitions to be an elder statesman, I think this is sort of a leaderless movement right now. And that is a distinction from the original pink tide, when in many ways Hugo Chavez of Venezuela sort of led this thinking. He didn't speak for some of the moderate, more democratic leftist governments in places like Chile and Uruguay, but he had a lot of resources in order to promote and export these ideologies, given the booming oil sector for much of his time in office. And at this point, there's great divisions amongst the left of Latin America, or certainly there's a lot of internal struggles that have led leaders to look within their countries and struggle to create or recreate ideologically driven kind of institutions. So what I would say is it's frankly, this new pink tide doesn't really have an obvious leader, and certainly not a leader with the resources to spread around the region and support like-minded presidents.
John, I think I slightly disagree with Benjamin. I agree that regional fragmentation is a huge issue. In the past, the first pink tide, Hugo Chavez, as Benjamin was mentioning, had this grand scheme called Petrocaribe, where he was providing oil at discount, practically free prices to countries of the Caribbean, to Central America, particularly Cuba. With the decline of Venezuela's oil sector, that has basically collapsed, except for, I think, what remains, which is a small oil subsidy to Cuba. But what is, I think, a continuity is Lula's, in Brazil's, quest for regional leadership. In the first iteration of leftist governments in the 2000s, Lula was really trying to create Brazil-led unity in South America. Mexico was seen as having cast its lot with the United States and with Canada. So there were these new institutions called UNASUR that were dominated by Brazil. Brazil is continuing now to reinvigorate or attempt to reinvigorate UNASUR. Lula has cast himself, his administration has cast itself as an arbiter of global politics, an attempt to mediate the crisis in Ukraine. How effective that will be, one doesn't know. But I would say that the continuity between this period and the previous period is in Brazil's quest for essentially South American leadership / dominance.
Yeah, I guess I would say I think it's true that Lula would hope to play that role, maybe even more so than AMLO. I just don't think it'll happen, Cindy. I mean, I think Lula just squeaked into office. He's got a lot of trouble getting support in Congress. He, suffered January 8th, as this incredible attack on Brazilian institutions. I just don't think he has the wherewithal to lead this leftist movement, such as it is.
Chris, I want to turn to you, if I could. We were having a conversation before we began recording, and you had some interesting observations on what Canada might represent in this regard. And whether or not there might be some lessons for other nations and other governments. Could you share that with our listeners?
Oh, absolutely, John. I think one of the things that strikes me looking at this from more experience with Canada is the role that commodities play as an underpinning of the regional economy. Canada is a big commodity producer, so are many of these countries. And one of the things that has tended to characterize these movements is the sudden increase in commodity prices, or the potential that whether it's copper or critical minerals or maybe gold or whatever it is going to create a windfall. And the thing about commodities, they come out of the ground, they're part of the public, sort of the part of the country's patrimony. You could use oil as another example, certainly affecting Mexico and other countries. And when these commodity price booms come in and suddenly it looks like there's this great chance to move the country forward, we've seen governments advance redistribution. Like, how can we address income inequalities with some of the revenues that come in? And I think we sometimes think, oh, well, that's socialist, so let's call it a pink tide. But it isn't quite. It's an attempt to sort of figure out how to work with a commodity price surge, which can be a huge impact. Now, Canada, luckily, has diversified enough that those commodity price cycles aren't as dramatic. But I can point out that almost all of the governments in this region, few exceptions, but including very much the United States and Canada, are governments of the center left. And, it's a question maybe of how far, and we don't go as far as the authoritarian side, but there definitely is a moment that we're in. That seems to be the direction. But what strikes me is that the commodity price boom that we're seeing now in certain commodities, particularly critical minerals, is one factor that is catching the attention of governments and maybe changing the politics of the region.
I want to get some thoughts on the impact on hemispheric relations. Chris, maybe we could start with you on Canada and the question. Here's something that Al Jazeera said, writing about this pink tide about a year ago. They called it a region-wide rejection of U.S. policies. Pretty blunt assessment. I don't know if anyone would agree with it as bluntly as they stated it. And then looming in the background, of course, is China and other options that didn't exist in the same way 20 years ago that they do today for alignment among nations, especially as it relates to economics. Chris, can we first get your thoughts on these hemispheric relationships, and then we'll work our way south?
No, absolutely, John. I think this is a very important factor. And right as we were recording this, the G7 are meeting in Hiroshima, Japan. And one of the themes there is to address an argument and a policy suite across the G7 to reach out to what we're calling now the global South, as countries that are developing countries that are sympathetic to China, because China buys commodities, particularly critical minerals, and processes them and offers a way out of poverty for a lot of countries, an engine for development. It's important for the West to respond in kind. And Canada's in a funny position. Typically, it would say, oh, well, let's play the China card and we can get more development attention from the Americans. The Americans will want to buy more of our things. But because of the two Michaels, Canada can't really play the China card right now. It's not in a mood to. But many of the countries in Latin America could, or at least could consider it. So it's very important for the United States, for Canada in approaching the hemisphere, to recognize that it has options, and that in response to this, it's important to offer something positive, carrots, if you will, not just sticks.
Mm-hmm. Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as always, lots of things to respond to. I mean, I think I guess one thought is that there is the effort maybe to recreate UNASUR, but there's also a lot of talk about CELAC, which is UNASUR plus Mexico and the Caribbean and Central America, I suppose, that Lopez Obrador has attempted to reinvigorate again as sort of a counterweight or a rejection of the OAS. And I think Cindy and Benjamin would remember better than I, but UNASUR was sort of the same thing, right? An effort to sort of create a Latin American multilateral organization that excluded the U.S. and Canada. So that's maybe a parallel or sort of bringing up an old habit. It isn't certainly clear to me how in reality how CELAC and UNASUR and the OAS would coexist. The other thing I think is kind of interesting, I don't really know the answer to this, is that, you might think that with a pink tide, as Chris pointed out, that the U.S. government is also certainly more to the left, but it seems that if there's a commonality of overall vision, it's not necessarily creating a great harmony between the government. So, and maybe that gets to that whole point of it, some of it being more of an anti-incumbent reaction than necessarily a desire to create some kind of a unified leftist Western Hemisphere.
Cindy and Benjamin, as we get your thoughts on the implications for hemispheric relations, I want to introduce another factor into the equation we haven't talked about yet that maybe you can roll into your analysis. And that is about something else that's different from 20 years ago is the prominence of climate change as an issue and the impact of extreme weather. Reuters, in their analysis, said the region's new pink tide has a distinct green tint. And this could be also an area of cooperation, say, from the perspectives of the current Canadian and U.S. governments. Cindy Benjamin, your thoughts on this. Cindy, we'll begin with you.
Sure, John. I think the environmental agenda is front and center, especially for Colombian President Gustavo Petro, also for Chilean President Gabriel Boric. They have made a shift to renewables, a major policy priority, and it does create a lot of common ground with the Biden administration. And I would say that in the case of the Colombian government, where things that Gustavo Petro has said and directions that he has taken, the country have raised eyebrows, if not hackles, in the United States. The common emphasis on the energy transition, green economy is a great area of overlap between U.S. government policy and Colombian government policy. There's obviously a great deal of criticism within Colombia about how rapidly Petro is trying to, to engineer that transition. In the case of U.S.-Colombian relations, the issue of narcotics trafficking and coca cultivation, continues to be an important factor in the relationship. But yes, and Lula as well is a leader in attempting to reverse these historic levels of deforestation that occurred during the previous government of Jair Bolsonaro. So there is a great deal of commonality among left governments, but also between these governments in the United States on this issue.
Benjamin, as we move into our final minutes, the potential is that this could be one of our last answers. So I have to put a lot of pressure on you, not just to respond to what you've been hearing, but also a thought I have is, can you talk to us about whether or not this pink tide has legs, in the sense that, we're always quick sometimes to crown an election or as a forebearer of the new reality, right? I think of Karl Rove in this country talking about a permanent conservative a majority when George W. Bush was president, and then along came Barack Obama. And so if you could also comment not just on hemispheric relations, but also about whether or not the trend lines indicate that this tilt to the left has legs.
I'd be happy to, John. First thing I'd say is environmental issues are actually not the only area for bridge building right now for the United States. These new pink tide leaders are simply not reflexively anti-American like some of their predecessors were. And so LGBT rights, women's equality, the fight against poverty, labor rights, there's a big menu of issues that they're interested or even willing to work with the United States on. And I think the Biden administration shares a lot of those priorities and is trying to find examples of ways the United States can work with democratic, pragmatic, leftist figures throughout the Americas. We've got plenty of examples of them already, and I think we'll see plenty more. I'll just add one, which is, countries like Argentina and Chile that have a lot of the critical minerals needed for batteries for electric vehicles, such as copper and lithium. You're seeing lots of efforts by all sides to work together to strengthen these green energy supply chains. Now, whether this is even worth talking about because it might be so short is an open question. What I would say, John, is don't blink. This is a very fast political cycle. It's because of the anti-incumbency. It's because, right now these leaders are already struggling. Leaders like Gabriel Boric, very unpopular. Gustavo Petro in Colombia has lost popularity very quickly and has just had a dramatic change in his cabinet. Lula was elected, by a very small margin and faces a lot of dissent domestically. And so there's every reason in the world to think that this cycle is going to rotate, in a New York minute. And I think, we'll start with the election in Argentina, and then it will just go from there. The only other example I'll give is just recently, a few days ago in Chile, you had an election for a constitutional convention, a process that was earlier dominated by the left and folks affiliated with the government is now dominated by the center right and the far right in Chile. Lots of other examples we'll see in the near future, including the recent presidential election in Paraguay.
We sort of end where we began with Cindy's history lesson. Tides rise, tides fall. So stay tuned. Of course, we'll be talking about this more in the future. Thanks to all of you today for your insights, and we look forward to learning more from you in the future. This episode of America's 360 was produced by Oscar Cruz with the assistance of Javi Delgado, Aldrin Ballesteros, Emma Brown, and Sarah Doshi. They always make us look and sound good, so thanks to all of you for your great work behind the scenes. We'll be back soon with another episode of America's 360. Until then, on behalf of the A360 team and all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. I want to thank you for your time and interest.
You have been listening to America's 360, a podcast about the innumerable ties among the nations of the Western Hemisphere. You can subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. To learn more about our programs, please visit wilsoncenter.org. And please join us again next time for another episode of America's 360.